Welcome to the next episode of HR Mavericks podcast. I'm Garrett Justice, and today I'm joined by Earl Foote, who's the CEO at Nexus IT and just an awesome guy with an amazing beard and hat. Earl, it's great to have you on the show today.
Hey, Garrett, it's such a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate the invitation. Totally my honor.
Hey, we are super excited to have you on the show and super excited to dive into this topic too. And you know what, Earl, I just feel bad for those who are just listening to this and not watching the video. So if you're just listening, you got to come find the video and just admire how great Earl looks with his hat and his beard. I think that's one of the first things people notice about you, right? Is that awesome look.
I appreciate that, man. Definitely, I guess I've got a personal brand. It certainly ties to the my alter ego, the rock and roll side of me that, I do play in a rock band. And so, I am maybe a little unconventional sometimes for your standard tech CEO, right?
No, we love it. We love it. We love when people can just kind of be themselves. And sounds like we're going to have to dedicate another episode at a future time to just talking about the rock band experience. But we'll see how much that we get today. So, Earl, it's great to have you here again. Why don't you tell our listeners just a little bit more about you and what you do, and also your company, Nexus IT?
Yeah, sure. So I have been an entrepreneur for going on about 24 years. I started Nexus IT at 23 years of age. So I've actually now been doing it more than half of my lifetime. I'll be 47 in a few weeks. So
Awesome.
24 out of my 47 years have been as an entrepreneur. I've had other ventures, still have some other active ventures and different investments and things like that. But, my primary focus over the last 2.5 decades has been Nexus IT. I didn't study business. I studied civil engineering and ended up in technology as an entrepreneur, and have definitely taken my lumps along my pathway and my road, and have had a great journey of learning. And a lot of really important people have taught me lots of important things over the years that has contributed to where we are now in our journey, and significant success and momentum at the moment. And that's all really exciting. We as an organization, we help take IT and cybersecurity off the plates of senior business leadership units so that they can focus on their core business and growing that, and refining their operations. And we manage all their technology, cybersecurity, and compliance behind the scenes so that they don't have to deal with it. And we do a pretty damn good job at it. Actually, we actually get quite a few awards and things because we work hard. We have a team that cares, that deeply cares about making sure that we take care of our clients and that we take care of each other. And as such, I think we've created a winning formula that we're scaling, quite fast, and having a good time in the process.
It's awesome. I love it. And, I'm super excited to dive into, that wealth of experience that I know you have in just the learnings of growing this team over the last little bit. And I can totally see why, Nexus IT has, had a lot of success, especially recently. I mean, that service is so important for really any business today, right? I mean, you don't even have to work in technology to have a need for your services, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely true. Every business needs what we do.
That's great. Well, I'm super excited to dive into this topic today, Earl. So really, when you and I were chatting about, what do we focus on for our conversation today, you really proposed this idea around the idea of building culture and really designing intentional culture, and how that can lead to high trust among teams. So I know you spent 23 plus years really trying to do that as you've grown your business and, had employees come and go. I know that's something that probably all business owners think about at some point. Because you have this wealth of experience, wanted to really just dive into this topic because it's also something you're really passionate about too, right?
Oh, absolutely. 100%. A big part of my journey as an entrepreneur and a CEO is that I care deeply about our people. I care about their families. I care about, how we take care of them and where their kids are going to go to college and all that kind of stuff. Right. And in that process, you have to kind of figure out the right balances to help create the right outcomes and equations for all of your stakeholders. I think one of in business, oftentimes, I think we tend to overcomplicate things, and particularly trying to figure out the right dynamics among a team.
Mm-hmm.
And really, some of the foremost experts around hyper functioning teams, and some who happen to be very close personal friends of mine, that they'll ultimately tell you that really the formula comes down to a couple of very basic things. Number one, do you have high trust within your teams? And number two, does everybody have psychological safety? And that's pretty much it, man.
Mm-hmm.
Like if people feel good at work, they trust the people that they work with. They know that each other, that they have each other's backs. They know that the leaders have their backs. They know that they're going to be taken care of and they're going to be rewarded and recognized fairly. In the end, most people they lean into that. They
Mm-hmm.
enjoy it, and they also build relationships of high trust within their inner circles within the organization. I can tell you, I took kind of an unconventional path in technology in Utah because, right now the hot thing is SaaS and product and gadgets and things like that. And that's all really cool and fun and sexy. I went the service route,
Mm-hmm.
and service-based businesses are no joke. They're not easy to scale.
Yeah.
And we're scaling at a very rapid pace right now. And what's enabled us to do that is really to nail this cultural piece, to really, because our product is people.
Mm-hmm.
Our product is human capital. And figuring out how to create the right experience and equations for our people so that they create the right experience for our clients has been the biggest part of our journey. And I most definitely, I can tell you that 23 years ago, 24 years ago, we did not have that nailed, right?
Yeah.
It's been this methodical process over time to figure out how we have high trust environments where everybody feels psychologically safe. And then we start producing, at a much higher rate together.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of been our process, man. I would say, we probably really started to nail our culture 8 or 10 years ago.
Mm.
And it just improves. It's not that we're there. I don't think culture's ever perfect.
Yeah.
And the market changes, people change, the world changes. And so you have to evolve with it, and you have to keep your finger kind of on the barometer and figure out what's shifting, why is it shifting, how do we address that shift, how do we continue to improve upon our relationships internally. And it's definitely been a journey that we continue to work on and continue to
Yeah.
perfect. Yeah.
It's good. That's so good. I mean, there's so much of what you just said that we could dive into, but one of the things that really stood out to me is I'm so glad that you talked about the differences that service businesses face, right? Where, your people are your product, right? I think so many of our listeners come from service-based small businesses, and they experience that, whether, you're a restaurant or you're an HVAC company or whatever it is, right? Like your people are your business, right? And that's your product. And so I think, especially in those companies, culture is super important. It's important in every company, right? Because it impacts, how you hire, and do you hire the right people, and attracting the right talent and keeping them there and retaining them. And we all know that those are issues that every small business is grappling with right now. But it's even more important, I think, in those service-based businesses, like you mentioned. So I'm so glad you brought that up.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, it's good stuff. So what I really want to dive into on this with you is culture. Why is it often misunderstood by companies? I feel like it's maybe it's just the fact that it's hard to really understand. I love how you just broke it down into two components really there, where it's about psychological safety and trust among teams. But why do you think that a lot of companies have a hard time really understanding and knowing how to tackle improving culture?
Yeah, totally. I've been here myself, right, in the journey, and when I, of course, culture's become a massive buzzword and become significantly more important. As our workforce has evolved their emotional intelligence, over the past couple of decades, it's something that that people we are trying to recruit and retain are looking for, right? They want to join a team that's got a cool vibe. They
Mm-hmm.
want to join a place where they can do meaningful work and they can feel fulfilled. And um, 20 years ago when I started, 23 years ago when I started, that wasn't nearly as prevalent. And you start to hear this buzzword kind of coming around. Yes, I know, 40, 50 years ago, large enterprises in corporate America were beginning to focus on corporate culture. But it's been this evolution, and it's definitely has sped up, a significant pace in recent years. And so I think, particularly in my own journey, and I see a lot of small and medium sized, business owners or executives kind of look at the giants around us, look at the Googles and the Apples of the world, and they go, well, they've got ping pong tables and they've got free daycare and all you can eat cafe and a gym in the building, and that's culture, right? But none of those are culture. None of them are. They can be cultural support mechanisms. They might be cultural detractors if you're not careful. Your culture, it boils down to how you act and behave within an organization, and that all boils down to the mindsets. How you think about your workday and how you think about the people you work with and the clients you work with, and the workload, right? Really, it's all about how do we actually act? How do we express ourselves? What is the mindset, behind all that? And then how do we govern based upon what we express is important to us? And usually that's, you have a set of declarations like, core values, you define 4 or 5 or 6, core values, 8 core values, maybe probably 6 is more than a really good number, but core values, vision statements, mission statements, cultural statements, you define, and that's part of culture by design, right? As senior leaders sitting down and going, what do we want the vibe to be around here, and how do we want to create this environment of trust and psychological safety? How do we feel that we can back into that and reverse engineer it, and do that through mindset and through actions and behaviors and governance, right? And that's really what culture is. If it may be all, fine and dandy and cool to have a ping pong table, and for, people to get along well around that pool, that ping pong table. But when they go and sit back down at their desks, if they can't stand each other and they won't talk to each other and they won't collaborate and they won't help each other and they won't extend, a safety line to each other when they're drowning, excuse me, you've got a problem, right? And so it's got to be, in today's hyper functioning sort of teams and really successful businesses, the team has to have each other's backs, and they've got to, look at a bigger picture. One of our core values is the practice of growth and abundance mindset. And so, we encourage and teach, evangelize to look at every situation and look at the world from a very holistic view. Step back, take your emotions out of it, kick your EQ into high gear, and say, how do I create the right experience and the right outcomes for all the stakeholders in this equation, right? And if you can kind of just keep, focused on that every single day, you start to see massive shifts, and people become more conscientious and more mindful about the people around them and the experience that they're giving to clients, and certainly the experience that we give to the community, right? That's important too. That's a stakeholder for us, right? Our community around us. And of course, in many businesses, you got board and shareholders and other types of, stakeholders that are part of that equation. And you just have to think about everybody. And sometimes I have to make some personal sacrifices because the equations need to line up for everybody. Nobody should be making massive sacrifice, and nobody should be giving more than they receive. But it's got to be pretty 50-50, and people have to start to realize and have a mindset shift that the equation doesn't have to be slanted in my favor. It should be aligned so that everybody's getting an equal sort of positive experience and positive outcomes out of this.
That's great. Great points. I'm so glad you brought up, that culture is not the ping pong table or the free food, because I think a lot of times, especially when people are early in their careers, they kind of get caught up in that. Like we kind of naturally think of those things as aligned with culture. Whereas, just like you said, it's not those things. Like those can be ways that you can add to or detract from your culture, but it's not those things, right? And so one of the things you really mentioned that I really liked is being intentional about your culture and designing an intentional culture versus, something that is a culture that comes about by default, because regardless of whether you focus on it or not, you're going to have a culture in your company, right? So you might as well be intentional about it and design a culture that you want to have rather than one that comes about just as default. So I guess my next question is really, how do you do that? Like you mentioned some of those things that you're doing at your company, but how should a company really get started on that path of being, designing an intentional culture rather than just allowing a default culture to emerge?
Yeah, very good. Which, by the way, whether you realize it or not, pretty much every facet of your life has a culture involved with it. Your neighborhood has a culture, maybe where you hang out with your friends has a culture, right? Your family has a culture to it. Again, your workplace has a culture. And the reality is, in most of those environments, those cultures are by default. They are a set of mentalities, behaviors, actions, and governance that just naturally happens in those spaces, right? And in few places do people really back up and go, okay, what do we really want this experience to be? And really, that's, by the way, my observation, and I could be completely off, but my observation is that in a workplace, most cultures by default are not very productive. When you're not mindful about this process, I think that you usually you give yourself a competitive disadvantage. And culture, by the way, can be a massive competitive advantage. But it starts at the top. It starts at senior leaders going, what do we really want this vibe and this dynamic to be? And what do we want the outcomes to be? And then reverse engineering from those outcomes back to where do we need to start? Because everything starts with mindset, man.
Yeah.
Everything, people, if they believe differently here than what they express here and how they act, it's incongruent, and that doesn't, you can't sustain that, right?
Yeah.
Sooner or later that breaks down. And so culture has to start at mindset, and in my opinion, but definitely in what I usually see, and what I would probably encourage is for most people, most leaders, to kind of look at, who am I outside of the office, right? What are the things I'm into? What do I like? I see a lot of like cool product companies that are based around outdoor activities, mountain biking and skating, and the founders oftentimes, like that's their passion in life, right? So look at your passions outside of business. I'm passionate about business. I'm passionate about building my business, but it's not the only passion I have. I already told you I'm in a rock band, right? I do enjoy the outdoors. I love to travel. And so you kind of look at, who am I as an individual outside of the office? What common ground do we have as a leadership unit there? And how do we want to infuse that into, and not only that, what are my personal core values? And sometimes as a leader, you've got to do that deep work to back into that. Oftentimes, if we haven't been intentional in that process, we may not know. We may say, yeah, well, honesty and integrity, which everybody says in their interview, right? I'm a hard worker, and we verbatim, you can kind of give that answer. But deep in your core as an individual, what is really important to you in life, and where do you want to focus your development and your core impact and legacy in life, right? And if you can start there and then find common ground with the leadership unit on some of the other cool things that you do outside of the office, and begin to say, okay, well, we want our internal culture to look like this. This is how we want, these are the kind of people we want to work with, and this is how we want to interact with each other. And these are how we want those relationships to work. And we want them to be healthy and productive, and we want to support each other. So yeah, for me, if you're a culture by default right now because you haven't done any intentional work around it, get to work, and start figuring out, if maybe you got to do some deep work on yourself to figure out first, and then do some deep work within the organization, and look at it, with an unbiased lens, because oftentimes the culture in many organizations is not healthy. And I'm not
Yeah.
saying that Nexus IT is 100% all the time.
Mm-hmm.
We aren't, we're human. There are bumps in the road. Things come up and you have to deal with them. And then sometimes you got to fine tune and tweak. But
Yeah.
okay, well, we've got a cultural leak, that COVID, for example, like COVID threw us all for a loop and
Mm-hmm.
brought many cultural leaks, in for our organizations, especially as we transition to distributed, and hybrid workforces. And so sometimes you just got to figure out how to patch the sieve, and you got to fine tune and tweak along the way. I know that's a lot of information, but
It's good stuff. It's good stuff. One thing that, really emerged from what you just said for me is really on that piece that you talked about, incongruence, right? So like if you're a company right now who hasn't spent as much time being intentional about your culture, and now you want to invest in doing that, you go through this process. How do you create a real intentional culture without it feeling fake or incongruent from what employees currently actually experience, right? Like how much of that culture should be what's actually happening and what's real versus what's aspirational for your company?
yeah, very, very good question, Garrett. And I think this is a massively important point. Backing up real quick, this is why I suggest that you design culture around who you are as a founder or as a founding unit, right?
Mm-hmm.
Design culture around what's true and real to you today. Um, because, by the way, culture needs to start from the top. And if leaders are professing something in word or trying to govern by, something that they're professing, but they don't actually live that, nor do they espouse the mindset behind it,
Mm-hmm.
you will have incongruence. And whether it's consciously or subconsciously, the team will pick up on that.
Mm-hmm.
And that incongruence will lead to a breakdown in the culture, whether it's severe or whether it's minor, but any detraction from culture detracts your momentum, right? It slows you down. And so, and it breaks down those relationships of trust and psychological safety. And so, if as a leader, what you express isn't true, that psychological safety and that trust is not going to be there with your team members, right? And
Mm-hmm.
vice versa. You need for what they say and how they act to be true, and support, you as well. And so, for me, again, no culture is perfect, right? No culture is 100%. And so, yes, there's probably some aspirational statements and and like, how do you shift mindset? You talk about, a target of where you want to get, right?
Mm-hmm.
You may not be there now. So yes, there's probably a balance. Maybe it's, and I don't know the equation, man. Maybe it's 70% reality. Maybe it's 30% aspirational, right?
Yeah.
Something along those lines. Maybe it's 80-20.
Yeah.
But it does need to be weighted heavier on the side of what is real today. Um, and then, yes, any culture, you've got to be working towards improvement. You got
Mm-hmm.
to be working to shifting those mindsets so that then the actions and behaviors and the words start to line up, and the governance, lines up as well. So yeah, that's my thoughts on that.
That's good. And if I can share just a quick example too, that just came to mind of something we did actually at our company, Eddie, about a year ago as a leadership team, we kind of revisited, as the company has kind of grown and evolved, what are our core values? What do we care most about? How do we define this culture? And we went through this process and came up with, 4 or 5 core values, and one of those was more aspirational. We saw some elements of it, and we knew it was important to us, but we didn't necessarily, we knew it was something we needed to continue working on as an organization. The rest were core and inherent, but this one was more aspirational. It was really around gratitude. How can we be more grateful and express that gratitude? And so then in our systems, we implemented ways to, make that more apparent. So as an example, as we start all of our like executive team meetings, we all go around and express, one thing that we're grateful for right there. And that kind of came from our CEO, which I love. It's something that, there was some truth to it, but it was more aspirational. And then we looked for ways to kind of embed it more in our culture. And it's really become a core part of now, after, 12, 18 months, a core part of like who we are and what we do. And that's bled through the rest of the organization,
So awesome. Such a really great example. And I love the idea of, that gratitude sort of roundtable thing in executive meetings. And you're absolutely right. There are targets you need to reach within a culture. And again, the modeling of those targets have to start at the top.
Mm-hmm.
You need the executive leadership team to say, okay, well, we want to create more gratitude. We want to create this cool vibe of like, everybody loves each other, and we're supporting each other, and we're thankful for what each, how we're receiving and giving that support, right? And so therefore, as leaders, we need to start that in our own little organism, our own unit, and then we need
Yeah.
to trickle that down throughout the team. So yeah, modeling. And by the way, and this is, you got to do this in life too, like
Yeah.
when you want to reach a new pinnacle, you've got to start modeling the correct mindsets and behaviors behind that, the correct words behind that. You got to create the right habits, right? And so that's part of it. Yes, you need targets to work towards. You need to start as a leadership unit to work towards those, and then you need to teach and evangelize those. But you need to lead by example. You
Yeah.
need to show people what that means to you, right?
Yeah. That's great. Awesome. Well, Earl, as we kind of get close to wrapping up here, I'm curious is what would you recommend for those who are listening out there who want to strengthen their culture and be more intentional about designing, an intentional culture rather than that culture by default, like we talked about? Where should they start, and what's the encouragement or benefits that you've seen from really focusing on this?
Yeah. In business, for me, usually I would start with a gap analysis, right? So try to figure out if you can get your team to engage with some sort of anonymous, type of feedback mechanism where they can tell you what their perception of culture is now. And then you begin to create your targets of where you want culture to be, right?
Mm-hmm.
What should it be? Again, you got to start to sit down as a leadership unit and actually be intentional and actually start to put some words behind this and design it. But you got to figure out, there's going to be a gap, and so you've got to start to figure out how to close that gap. And again, closing that gap has got to revolve around trust and psychological safety.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just starting there. And by the way, if you don't know how to do this kind of stuff, there are plenty of consultants, and I know
Mm-hmm.
consultants that can help with this kind of stuff. If anybody wants to reach out, I know people that, that work specifically on helping to define the gaps in culture, define where you want to go with it, and then help you build the right plans to get there, right? And the right cultural support mechanisms within your organization and all that kind of stuff. And it's like anything in business, it's a matter of trial and error. It's A/B testing. You do little tweaks along the way and you test them out and you see if it helps, right? And if it doesn't, you get rid of it and you try something different,
Mm-hmm.
a different initiative, right? We're constantly, kind of little different cultural support mechanisms. We don't want to do too much because
Mm-hmm.
you can't disrupt people's mojo too much, right?
Yeah.
In their day to day. But every quarter or so, we're kind of like, well, let's try something different and let's see what that does and what results it gives us. By the way, just you asked about why.
Yeah.
Why does it matter, right? Because there's definitely an old school, thought, where it's just kind of like, let's just do business and forget about all the nuances and,
Mm-hmm.
like, these little intricacies, and this is all hippie woo woo stuff, right? And like I get that.
Yeah.
I was probably in that old school camp, early on in my days.
Mm-hmm.
But I can tell you unequivocally, first of all, if you want to have good relationships with people, which, why not have great relationships with people that you spend half of your life with?
Mm-hmm.
You know, um, you've got to start working on a productive culture that produces the right results and outcomes and experiences for everybody. But just tangibly, when you have a better culture in an organization, when people feel good, they enjoy the work they do, they feel fulfilled, they like the people they're working with, they perform, they produce, they create the outcomes that are needed for your business, for your clients, and for your team members, right? And so if you want to be more successful, nailing culture is definitely a massive part of that equation. And I can tell you, as we've nailed our culture, that has been one of the main keys to our success, and being able to grow and scale, and particularly in a service-based business,
Yeah.
like hiring for cultural fit, making sure that people are ready day one to dovetail right in and to move forward. Doesn't mean they maybe not 100%, but they're 70 or 80% the way there, and they love the fact that they're given the opportunity to backfill that 30%, and hone their skills and their capabilities and their mindset, and they want to do that, right? They want to grow and be part of it. So why do it? Because you're going to be more successful, just transparently. But then, you are, as a leader, going to have a much better experience. A lot of the problems you deal with in business and HR and with people, they can be cleaned up as long as you have a good culture, and you don't have to deal with a lot of them. It doesn't mean all of them, but a lot of them can go away. And I can attest to that. 10 or 12 years ago, I dealt with a lot more HR problems than I do today, because, people have a better experience in the workplace now.
Yeah. Love it. Amen to everything you just said. So good. Earl, this has been such an awesome conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time to share, your experiences and your knowledge with us on this topic. As we get close to wrapping up here, one of the last questions I like to ask all of our guests on the show is just, what's one thing that you think our listeners should do this week to improve their HR or people functions?
I would suggest, take a deep look at your interpersonal relationships within your organization, and start to model how you can create more trust and more psychological safety in those. That one exercise, and just being mindful and starting to change, a little bit, your words and your actions and your deeds and your mindset will begin, to make shifts that make ripples, and you'll start to see those ripples have a larger effect within your department, and then within the organization as a whole. Every stakeholder in a workplace is important to corporate culture. Every stakeholder can either be a contributor or they can be a detractor. So choose to be a contributor. Look at yourself, look at what you need to change, and start changing.
Love it. Great tip. And last question I have for you, Earl, is if there are listeners who want to get in contact with you, either to learn more about how they could leverage your services there at Nexus IT, or if they have follow-up questions on this, what's the best way for them to contact you?
Let's see. Look for me on LinkedIn, Earl Foote, CEO of Nexus IT. On the web, we're at nexusitc.net. Locally here in Utah, our number is 801-839-7006. There is a toll-free number for outside of Utah, but I don't know it off the top of my head.
That's okay. We'll drop all that information into the show notes, so you can find that there if you're listening. So Earl, thanks again so much for joining the show today. Hope you have a great rest of the day.
Likewise. Thanks so much for having me, Garrett. It's been such a pleasure.